Hi guys. Tonight we're going to explore about the Viking who reached America first. Before you settle in, take a moment, turn off the lights, and simply listen. Enjoy the story as it unfolds, slowly, carefully, like history itself. Now get ready to travel back 500 years. Before Columbus, before maps, before memory, the Viking who reached America first. Long before airplanes crossed oceans, long before satellites mapped the edges of continents, and long before the name America existed, there were people who lived with the sea as their daily companion. This is not a story of loud discoveries or dramatic moments. This is a quiet story about patience, survival, and a world slowly expanding beyond what was known. We begin far north in Scandinavia, where the land was cold, rocky, and often unforgiving. Winters were long and dark, summers were short and uncertain. Farming was possible, but never easy. Life followed a slow rhythm dictated by weather, daylight, and seasons that rarely showed mercy. The people we now call Vikings did not see themselves as conquerors. Most were farmers, craftsmen, fishermen, and traders. They lived simple lives close to nature, where preparation mattered more than ambition. Every winter required planning. Every journey required trust, in tools, in experience, and in each other. The sea was not a barrier to them, it was a road. Their ships were not large by modern standards, but they were brilliantly designed. Long ships were built from overlapping wooden planks, flexible enough to ride waves without breaking. They moved quietly, powered by wind or steady rowing. These ships could cross open oceans and also glide into shallow rivers. This made them perfect for exploration, though that word did not yet exist in their minds. Navigation was slow and uncertain. There were no detailed maps, no compasses, no precise measurements. Vikings watched the sun and stars. They read the direction of waves. They noticed changes in water color and temperature. Birds were especially important. If birds flew toward land, land was likely near. Sailing west meant something very different back then. It meant leaving the known world behind. It meant weeks of uncertainty, where storms could erase any sense of direction. It meant trusting that the horizon held something other than endless water. By the late 9th century, Viking sailors had already reached Iceland, not by careful planning, but largely by accident. Ships blown off course found a cold but livable island. Over time, settlers followed. Homes were built, fields were cleared. Iceland became a place where life continued, quietly and steadily. And once people settle, curiosity begins to grow. From Iceland, the world felt unfinished. The horizon seemed closer. Stories began to circulate. Pieces of driftwood washing ashore that could not have come from Iceland. Birds flying from the west, not toward it. Rumors of land beyond the sea, vague and unproven, but persistent. These were not grand legends. They were small observations, and history often turns on small things. This is how the idea of another land began, not as a destination, but as a possibility. A quiet thought passed from sailor to sailor, from one winter evening to the next. What if there was more land beyond the ocean? What if the sea did not end where they thought it did? No one knew the answer yet, but the question was enough. Exile, ice, and the first step west. In the Viking world, reputation mattered. A single argument could follow a person for years. A single act of violence could erase an entire future. Law was not written on paper. It lived in memory, in witnesses, and in judgment spoken aloud. Eric the Red was not born a discoverer. He was born into conflict. His father had been banished from Norway for killing a man. That exile pushed the family west, across the sea, until they settled in Iceland. It was already a land shaped by chance, founded by people who arrived not by design, but by necessity. Eric grew up there, surrounded by long winters and narrow valleys. He learned how fragile life could be. He learned how quickly anger could change everything. As an adult, Eric became involved in disputes over land and property. These disagreements did not end quietly. Weapons were drawn, blood was spilled, and under Icelandic law, there was only one outcome. Eric was sentenced to exile. Exile was not a temporary inconvenience. It meant losing home, safety, and community. It meant sailing away with no guarantee of return. For many, exile was a slow death. For Eric, it became an opportunity. During his punishment, Eric remembered stories he had heard, rumors of land to the west, cited by earlier sailors but never settled. With nothing left behind him, he turned his ship toward uncertainty. The journey was long and unforgiving. Ice filled the water. Fog erased direction. The coastline, when it finally appeared, was harsh and unfamiliar. Massive glaciers pressed against rocky shores. This was not a welcoming place, but it was land. Eric explored the coast for years, moving carefully, surviving by experience rather than hope. He found fjords sheltered from wind, patches of land where grass could grow during short summers. It was not easy, but it was possible. When Eric's exile ended, he returned to Iceland with a plan. He named the land Greenland, not because it was green, but because names matter. He spoke calmly, confidently, describing wide fjords and grazing land. He did not promise comfort, he promised survival. And people listened. Families who struggled in Iceland followed him west. Ships crossed the sea carrying livestock, tools, and expectations. Small settlements formed along the coast. Life in Greenland was slow, quiet, and difficult, but it existed. And that was enough. From Greenland, the world felt different again. The ocean no longer felt endless. It felt incomplete. Sailors noticed driftwood stronger than anything found locally. They spoke of distant lands, glimpsed briefly through mist. One story stood out, a sailor blown off course who claimed to have seen a flat, forested coastline far to the west. He never landed, he never explored, but he planted another question. If Greenland existed, what else might be waiting? This was not exploration driven by curiosity. It was expansion driven by habit, step by step, island by island, shoreline by shoreline. In the next part, we will follow the man who took that question seriously, the man who did not just see land, but walked on it. The journey west was no longer accidental. It was about to become intentional. Leif Erikson and the Quiet Crossing. As the story continues, the Western Ocean no longer feels like an empty space. It has become familiar, even routine. Greenland now exists on the map of the Viking world, not as a mystery, but as a place where people live, work, and endure. And when something becomes familiar, curiosity naturally moves one step farther. Leif Erikson grew up surrounded by this quiet curiosity. He was the son of Eric the Red, raised in a world shaped by exile, long journeys, and narrow chances. Unlike his father, Leif was known not for anger, but for calm judgment. He listened more than he spoke. He learned by watching, and he understood the sea not as an enemy, but as a system, one that rewarded patience. Stories of land to the west had never disappeared. They lived quietly in conversation, repeated during long winters, never fully believed, but never forgotten. One sailor in particular had spoken of a distant coastline, flat, forested, and different from anything in Greenland. He had never landed, he had simply seen it and sailed away. That was enough to leave an impression. Leif decided to go back. This time, The journey was not accidental, it was planned carefully, with a small crew, enough supplies, and clear intention. There was no announcement, no ceremony, just preparation, quiet confidence, and departure. The crossing was slow. Days passed in steady rhythm. The sea changed color, the air softened, birds appeared where there should have been none. Then, finally, land. Leif and his crew reached a coastline that felt unfamiliar in a gentle way. The land was not frozen, trees stood tall and close together, rivers moved calmly, the soil felt different beneath their feet. This was not Greenland, this was something new. They explored carefully, moving inland only when necessary. They named the places they saw, not with poetry, but with observation. A land of flat stones, a land of forests, and finally, a place they called Vinland, named for wild grapes or berry-like plants growing naturally. This mattered more than it seemed. For the first time, Europeans had stepped onto the mainland of North America, not as conquerors, not as settlers, but as visitors, curious, cautious, and temporary. They built simple shelters, they repaired their ships, they stayed through part of the year, learning the land by living within it. The experience was calm, almost ordinary, and that is what makes it extraordinary. There were no monuments, no written records made at the time, no announcement to the wider world. When Leif eventually returned to Greenland, he spoke of what he saw, but quietly, without exaggeration. And the world continued as it always had. But something had changed. The ocean had been crossed intentionally. The land had been touched deliberately. The unknown was now known, even if only by a few. As this part of the journey comes to rest, one question remains. If land existed and it was usable, why did the story not continue? In the next part, we will see what happens when curiosity meets reality, when settlement is attempted and the land begins to push back. The quiet crossing was complete. The challenge was just beginning. Vinland and the attempt to stay. As the journey continues, discovery slowly turns into decision. Seeing land is one thing, returning to it is another. By the time stories of Vinland reached Greenland, the idea of going back no longer felt impossible, it felt practical. Vinland was different from everything the Vikings knew. Greenland offered survival. Vinland offered abundance. Trees were everywhere. Fresh water was easy to find. The climate, though unfamiliar, was far less severe. For people used to scarcity, this mattered deeply. So the question changed. Not, does this land exist, but can we live here? A small group returned, not as explorers, but as settlers. They brought livestock, tools, and expectations shaped by Greenland life. Simple structures were built, functional, temporary, and quiet. The goal was not conquest, it was balance. Life in Vinland followed a slower rhythm. Days were spent gathering resources, nights were cautious but calm. The land did not resist them openly, it simply remained itself. Then came the encounters. The Vikings were not alone. They met people who already knew the land, communities who had lived there for generations. The Vikings called them Skrælings, a word that revealed uncertainty more than hostility. Communication was limited. Curiosity existed on both sides. At first, interactions were cautious and brief. Trade happened, small exchanges, no speeches, no alliances. But difference creates tension. The Vikings lived by rules shaped by distance and scarcity. The local communities lived by patterns shaped by familiarity and continuity. Neither side fully understood the other. Small misunderstandings grew quietly. And then, slowly, the balance began to shift. Vinland was not empty. It was not waiting. It belonged to others, and the Vikings, for all their experience, were far from home. Conflicts were brief, scattered, and never decisive, but they were enough. The settlement was small, supplies were limited, reinforcements were far away. Staying no longer felt practical. Leaving did not feel like failure, it felt like realism. The decision was made quietly. Shelters were abandoned, tools were packed, the land returned to silence. Vinland remained unchanged, touched briefly, then left behind. And with that, something remarkable happened. The first European attempt to stay in North America ended without drama, without war, and without legacy. The story faded, not because it was unimportant, but because it was unresolved. As this chapter closes, we begin to understand why history forgot this moment. Not every discovery reshapes the world immediately. Some simply exist, waiting to be remembered. In the next part, we will see how Vinland survived not in maps, but in memory, passed quietly through stories that almost disappeared. The land remained. The knowledge lingered. When a discovery becomes a story. As the settlement quietly disappears from Vinland, the journey does not truly end. It simply changes form. The Vikings did not leave behind cities or monuments. What they carried home instead were memories, descriptions of land, of forests, of encounters that felt unfinished. And in the Viking world, memory mattered. History was not written in books, it lived in voices, in stories shared beside firelight during long winters. What happened in Vinland became part of that tradition, not as a triumphant discovery, but as something quieter, more uncertain. People listened, they asked questions, but life continued. Greenland still demanded attention, crops needed tending, livestock needed care. Survival remained the priority. Vinland was remembered, but it was distant, both geographically and emotionally. Stories change when they are told slowly over time. Details soften, certainty fades. Vinland became less a place and more an idea, a land that existed once, somewhere to the west, reachable but not necessary. And so it slipped. Not because it was forgotten entirely, but because it was no longer urgent. Generations passed, the original sailors aged and died. New challenges emerged. Greenland itself became harder to maintain as climate conditions shifted. Winters grew longer, trade became less reliable, attention turned inward. Vinland remained untouched. It did not appear on maps, it did not inspire immediate return. Instead, it waited, quietly, patiently, beyond the horizon. What makes this remarkable is not that the Vikings failed to colonize North America, it is that they were content not to. Discovery alone did not demand expansion. Knowledge did not always lead to action. And then, slowly, something changed in Europe. Centuries later, curiosity would return. Ships would grow larger, navigation would become more precise, maps would evolve. The ocean would be crossed again, not by memory, but by calculation. But by then, the Viking story had faded. As this part draws to a close, we see how history can lose something not through destruction, but through disinterest. Vinland did not vanish, it simply stopped being discussed. In the next part, we will step away from the Vikings themselves and look at the wider world, how Europe moved forward without knowing how close it had already come to a new continent. The silence around Vinland grew, and the world moved on. Vinland, memory, and the quiet disappearance. As the ship slowly pulled away from Vinland, nothing dramatic marked the moment. There were no final speeches, no sense of loss carved into stone. The land remained exactly as it was, forests standing still, rivers flowing as they always had. The Vikings left without altering the landscape in any permanent way. They carried something else instead. They carried memory. Back in Greenland, life quickly returned to its familiar rhythm. Animals needed tending, homes needed repair, the seasons demanded attention. Vinland was discussed, but only occasionally. It was spoken of during long winter nights, when stories helped pass the darkness. It was described carefully, without exaggeration. Land with trees, mild weather, and unfamiliar people. And then the stories began to soften. In Viking society, history lived through storytelling. There were no official records, no written accounts meant to preserve exact detail. Each retelling depended on the listener, the teller, and the moment. Over time, Vinland became less specific. The distance grew larger. The details became fewer. It was not forgotten. It was simply no longer immediate. Greenland itself became more difficult to sustain. The climate slowly cooled. Growing seasons shortened. Trade with Europe became less reliable. Survival once again required focus. When resources are limited, curiosity must wait. Vinland did not disappear from memory. It lost its urgency. And this is where history takes an unusual turn. The Vikings had reached North America. They had walked its land. They had lived there briefly. And then they chose, quietly and rationally, not to continue. There was no failure in this decision. There was only practicality. Without large populations, without political pressure, and without economic need, Vinland remained optional, and optional things are often left behind. As generations passed, the original witnesses were gone. New storytellers inherited fragments rather than full accounts. Vinland shifted from place to concept, from geography to legend. And legends, without reinforcement, fade. Meanwhile, Europe continued to change. Ships became sturdier, navigation slowly improved, trade routes expanded. Yet no one realized how close Europe had already come to a new continent. The knowledge existed, but it was quiet, unrecorded, and easy to overlook. As this part comes to rest, we begin to understand that history does not always move in a straight line. Sometimes it pauses, sometimes it steps back, sometimes it waits centuries to be noticed again. In the next part, we will explore how Vinland survived in fragments, hidden inside sagas, misunderstood by later readers, and almost dismissed as myth. The land was real. The memory was fragile. How Vinland lived inside the sagas. As time moved forward, the physical traces of Vinland slowly disappeared. Wood decayed. Footprints vanished. Fires went cold. But something remained, carried quietly through generations. The stories. In the Viking world, memory was preserved not through writing, but through oral tradition. These were not casual tales. They were structured narratives, repeated carefully so details would survive. Sagas were not entertainment alone. They were how identity was maintained. Vinland lived inside these sagas. At first, the stories were clear. They spoke of journeys west, of unfamiliar lands with forests and rivers, of encounters that were cautious and uneasy. The tone was not heroic, it was practical. Vinland was described as a place that existed, not a place that needed glorification. But as decades passed, storytellers changed. Each generation remembered different parts. Some focused on the bravery of the journey. Others remembered the strangeness of the land. Fewer remembered the exact routes, the distances, or the seasons. This is how geography slowly turns into narrative. Vinland became less a destination and more a backdrop. It appeared in stories about families, arguments, and decisions. It was mentioned, but rarely explained. And over time, listeners stopped asking where it was. They assumed it was far away, or symbolic, or exaggerated. Meanwhile, the sagas themselves began to be written down, centuries later. By then, the world had changed. Christianity had arrived, Latin writing traditions replaced older storytelling styles. What had once been spoken carefully now appeared on parchment, filtered through new perspectives. Some readers took the story seriously, others dismissed them. Vinland, to many, sounded unrealistic. Grapes in the far north, forests beyond Greenland, it felt improbable to scholars who had never seen such places. So Vinland slipped again, this time not from memory, but from belief. As European knowledge expanded during the Middle Ages, maps were drawn with increasing confidence. Coastlines were imagined, islands were added, but Vinland did not appear clearly. It remained vague, uncertain, and often ignored. And yet, the sagas remained, quietly waiting. They described ships that could cross oceans. They described land beyond known boundaries. They described encounters that felt restrained and human, not mythical. But history often favors what fits expectations. As this part draws toward its end, we begin to see how knowledge can survive without influence. Vinland existed inside stories for hundreds of years, present but powerless. In the next part, we will move forward in time to when European explorers sailed west again, unaware that they were retracing a path already walked. The stories had been there all along. The North Atlantic, ice, and the slow passage. The story of Vinland is not only a story of land, it is also a story of the sea, the vast, cold, and often unforgiving North Atlantic. To understand why the Vikings arrived there, why they left, and why their story almost disappeared, we must spend time with the ocean they crossed. It was not a single short journey. It was a slow passage, measured in days, weeks, sometimes months. It demanded endurance, patience, and quiet observation. Imagine being a Viking at the edge of Greenland. The fjords have become familiar. The ice flows are steady, predictable. The horizon stretches endlessly to the west. You look at the ocean and see not a body of water, but a living system. Waves speak, currents guide. The color of the sea tells you what lies below and what may lie beyond. Clouds are not just clouds, they're messages, hints of wind direction or warnings of storms. Birds are your allies. If they fly away from land, land lies somewhere else. If they circle, you pay close attention. Every voyage required meticulous preparation. Ships were checked plank by plank, sails were inspected, provisions calculated. Livestock, small tools, and personal belongings were carefully loaded. The journey could not be hurried. Impatience was dangerous. Mistakes were permanent. Unlike later explorers with detailed maps, compasses, or celestial instruments, Vikings relied on memory, observation, and centuries of accumulated knowledge. Every decision, from departure to landing, was a quiet negotiation with uncertainty. And yet, they sailed. Eric the Red had already shown that the ocean could be crossed intentionally, but Leif Erikson's journey marked a shift. It was no longer driven by exile or misfortune. It was driven by observation, by curiosity, and by planning. He followed the coastlines carefully, examined currents, noted bird migrations, and timed his departure with the sun and wind. This was slow, thoughtful navigation, an art form that modern travelers rarely appreciate. Crossing the North Atlantic was never simple. Storms could appear suddenly, waves towering above fragile wooden ships. Icebergs drifted unpredictably, each one a potential obstacle or hazard. Fog and cold could disorient even the most experienced sailor. Every day was a test, not of courage alone, but of endurance, judgment, and patience. There were no shortcuts. The ocean demanded time and respect. When land finally appeared,
It was not sudden or dramatic. There was no cheering, no flags raised. The coast emerged quietly from the mist, forests dense and rivers flowing gently. The Vikings observed. They landed cautiously, examining soil, water, and shelter opportunities. Each observation was cataloged in memory and story to be passed on later. And yet, the land did not welcome them openly. It was indifferent. Animals roamed freely. Weather changed without notice. Resources were plentiful in some areas, scarce in others. The Vikings adapted. They built small shelters. They tested the soil. They hunted and fished. Their presence was temporary but significant, a human footprint in a landscape that had never seen such visitors. As the years passed, the North Atlantic itself became a character in the story. Its currents, winds, and storms shaped the Vikings' choices. Greenland, Iceland, and Vinland were connected by these waters, yet each journey carried its own challenges. The ocean taught patience. It demanded observation. It rewarded careful planning and punished impulsiveness. Even after the Vikings left Vinland, the sea remained central to the story. Memory alone preserved their route. Knowledge of currents, coastal shapes, and seasonal patterns was encoded in oral traditions. When later explorers tried to retrace their steps centuries afterward, they often failed, not because the land had moved, but because the stories were no longer precise. They had been simplified, softened, and folded into legend. By reflecting on the North Atlantic, we begin to understand why the Viking experience in America was temporary. It was not because they lacked courage or curiosity. It was because they understood the limits imposed by nature. They knew that survival, not conquest, was the priority. They were practical, measured, and patient, traits we often overlook when we retell stories of exploration. And yet, there is beauty in this quiet approach. There is wonder in the realization that the Vikings crossed thousands of miles of unpredictable ocean, discovered new lands, and returned home, without maps, without modern instruments, guided only by careful observation and experience. The journey itself was as significant as the land it revealed. As this part comes to a close, consider the rhythm of their passage, slow, deliberate, intimate with the ocean, intertwined with the sky, the birds, and the ice. The story of Vinland is inseparable from the North Atlantic. The ocean is a teacher, and every sailor a student. In the next part, we will explore how these experiences, the crossings, the observations, and the memories were carefully preserved in sagas and oral traditions, and how these quiet records ensured that Vinland survived in memory even when it was forgotten on maps. The ocean carried them west, and in doing so, it carried the first whispers of a continent yet unknown to Europe.
The sagas and how Vinland survived in memory. As the ocean carried the Vikings back toward Greenland, Vinland began its slow transformation from a physical place into a story and then into memory itself. Unlike the lands they left behind, Vinland was not settled permanently. Its forests, rivers, and shores remained untouched by European hands. Yet it persisted in a quieter form, inside the sagas, in conversations beside fires, and in the long winters when stories became a necessary part of life. In the Viking world, the spoken word was more enduring than stone. Houses decayed, ships rotted, tools were lost, but stories could survive hundreds of years, passed from parent to child, from neighbor to neighbor. Memory was carefully curated. It was repeated in the same way each winter, sometimes with small variations, so that even as generations passed, the core remained intact, and Vinland became one of these stories. The sagas describe it in practical terms. They speak of fertile soil, flowing rivers, and abundant forests. They note the presence of unfamiliar people, whom they called Skrallings. The tone is calm,
restrained and observational. There are no grand battles, no heroic monologues. These were stories meant to record experience, not embellish it. They were designed to teach. They were designed to preserve knowledge for those who might one day need it. But the process of memory is delicate. As decades passed, the sagas were repeated and details began to shift. Distances became hazy. The exact location of Vinland became uncertain. Some storytellers emphasized the abundance of the land, others focused on the difficulties they faced. Conflicts with local people were remembered in some versions, forgotten in others. What had been an observation became a story, and the story became legend. By the time these oral histories were eventually written down centuries later, they had been filtered through generations. They were shaped not only by memory, but also by new cultural influences. Christianity had arrived in the north. Literacy was increasing. The stories had to fit new expectations. Vinland was no longer just a geographical place. It was a lesson, a myth, a possibility. Even as Europeans began exploring the Atlantic again, the memory of Vinland had already faded in practical terms. It was not on maps. It was not in trade plans. It existed quietly in sagas, waiting for those willing to listen carefully. Some later scholars dismissed the stories as exaggeration, fantasy, or myth. They were skeptical of grapes growing near Greenland. They doubted the existence of forested lands beyond the ice. And yet the core truth remained. Vikings had been there, walked the shores, and returned. What makes this remarkable is the restraint of the Vikings themselves. Unlike later explorers, they did not immediately claim ownership. They did not leave permanent settlements. They did not demand recognition. They acted quietly, carefully, and then left. Their journey was intentional but measured. They understood limits, the limits of ships, of supplies, of knowledge, and of human endurance. The land remained, and they respected it. Vinland, in a sense, was a place of humility. It taught the Vikings the value of observation, caution, and memory. They learned that knowing a place does not always mean controlling it, that discovery does not always require conquest, that some knowledge is more valuable when it is preserved quietly. As the sagas were passed down, Vinland became a symbol of exploration without glory. It was a record of subtle achievement. It was the story of crossing the ocean, stepping onto a new continent, and returning safely. It was a reminder that history is not only written in grand victories, but also in quiet understanding. By the end of this part, we begin to see why Vinland almost disappeared from history. It was not lost because it did not exist, but because it was no longer urgent, no longer convenient, and no longer necessary for survival. Its memory survived in words, not in maps. Its reality persisted in the careful recollections of those who had touched it, observed it, and returned home. In the next part, we will explore how later European voyages slowly began to rediscover the idea of a Western land, centuries after the Vikings' quiet journey. And we will see how Vinland's story, once almost forgotten, influenced the gradual awakening of Europe to a continent they had once almost reached. The land of Vinland had been walked, its memory had survived, and the ocean had carried both forward, patiently, quietly, and persistently.
The forgotten land and its echoes through time. As centuries passed, Vinland slowly receded from the practical world. Greenland remained a challenge, Iceland demanded attention. Life in the north was hard, slow, and unyielding, leaving little room for dreams of distant lands. And yet, Vinland never disappeared entirely. It survived quietly, in stories whispered beside fires during long winters, in sagas that parents repeated to children, in the memory of a world that had once brushed against the unknown. History, however, is selective. Written records favored places that were settled, conquered, or economically valuable. Vinland, having been touched only briefly, did not meet these criteria. Maps rarely included it. Chronicles of Europe ignored it, and slowly it began to exist primarily as myth, a possibility rather than a certainty. But myths can be powerful. They are not always false. They preserve fragments of truth that survive longer than stone or timber. The sagas, when carefully examined, tell us what modern records would not, that Europeans had crossed the Atlantic long before Columbus, that they had set foot on North American soil, that they had returned home to tell others quietly, without fanfare, and without immediate consequence. The narrative of Vinland is also a lesson in human behavior. The Vikings who traveled there understood limits. They knew the ocean could be cruel, the land could be unforgiving, and supply lines could fail. Survival mattered more than possession. Observation mattered more than conquest, and patience mattered more than glory. They acted with foresight and prudence, leaving the land undisturbed, ensuring that their story would endure in memory rather than in material occupation. Yet Vinland's influence persisted, albeit subtly. When the first European expeditions resumed centuries later, explorers unknowingly retraced routes partially revealed by the Vikings' memories. Sailors reported strange driftwood, unexpected currents, and signs of previous human presence that puzzled them. Though unacknowledged, the Vikings' quiet exploration had planted traces in the collective understanding of the North Atlantic. Knowledge had traveled west and returned, folded into stories and whispers, only to be rediscovered generations later. Vinland's story also reminds us how fragile knowledge can be. Without continued habitation or permanent structures, human memory is all that preserves experience. The sagas, repeated across decades, softened, adapted, and transformed into legend. Names changed, details shifted, the original locations became hazy, and some elements were embellished or forgotten entirely. The historical Vinland became a literary Vinland, a place between reality and imagination, carrying both fact and memory in the same breath. And yet, this transformation did not diminish its significance. Vinland represented possibility. It represented courage, not in the form of conquest, but in quiet perseverance and observation. It represented the delicate balance between knowing and surviving. Those who crossed the Atlantic and returned brought more than stories. They brought lessons, subtle but enduring, that would quietly influence generations long before Europe became aware of the Americas. As this part draws to a close, consider the extraordinary patience and restraint of the Vikings. They navigated an unpredictable ocean, discovered a new continent, interacted cautiously with its people, and returned home safely. Their memory of Vinland survived because it was recorded thoughtfully, repeated deliberately, and preserved by human memory. And centuries later, when Europe finally moved westward in search of new lands, Vinland existed already, quietly waiting in sagas and stories, guiding those who would listen carefully. In the next part, we will explore the early attempts of European explorers to reach the Atlantic coasts centuries after Vinland, and how the quiet legacy of the Vikings intersected with the ambitions of later generations. We will see how a forgotten journey influenced future exploration, often unrecognized but nevertheless present. Vinland remained unseen by most, yet its memory continued to echo across time. And those echoes would shape the story of exploration long before the New World was known to Europe.
The long shadow of Vinland. By the late Middle Ages, Europe had changed dramatically. Kingdoms had stabilized, commerce had expanded, sailors and merchants increasingly looked to the sea for opportunity. Yet, for most, the Atlantic remained a vast, mysterious expanse, rarely crossed beyond familiar coasts. And in the shadows of this growing curiosity, the stories of Vinland lingered, mostly forgotten, but quietly waiting to be remembered. The Vikings' journeys had left a trace. It was subtle, intangible, carried not in monuments, but in memory, in narrative. Oral traditions, passed from one generation to the next, whispered of a land to the west.
The details had softened, the precise locations were obscured, but the core truth remained. A new continent existed, reachable by sea, rich in forests, rivers, and life unknown to Europe. As European ships began to venture farther into the Atlantic, following coastlines and exploring islands, some of these sagas resurfaced. Navigators reported unexpected islands, driftwood from distant lands, and currents that suggested land lay beyond the horizon. Vinland, though unrecognized, had already informed the European imagination, silently shaping ideas about the West. This period also marked a shift in the European mindset. Curiosity became codified. Sailors kept logs, explorers were funded by monarchs, maps were increasingly accurate, and navigation began to rely on instruments rather than memory alone. In this environment, the quiet legacy of Vinland became a hidden precursor, a reminder that humans had already crossed, observed, and returned safely. Those who eventually charted the Americas were unknowingly following a path first traced centuries earlier. Vinland's story also teaches a subtle lesson about human ambition. The Vikings did not seek conquest. They did not claim the land permanently. They did not extract wealth or enslave the people they met. Their approach was cautious, deliberate, and sustainable. Survival was paramount. Knowledge was prioritized over glory. In contrast, the Europeans of later centuries pursued exploration with a different mindset, driven by trade, conquest, and empire. Yet even in these new ventures, the memory of the Vikings' prudence lingered invisibly, like a quiet shadow guiding the rhythms of careful navigation. The Atlantic itself continued to challenge and educate explorers. Storms could appear without warning, icebergs floated unpredictably, winds shifted, currents carried ships far from intended courses. Every journey required patience, observation, and respect for the ocean's power, lessons the Vikings had already learned, and lessons Europe would slowly relearn. In these voyages, Vinland remained a ghostly presence. Few understood it, fewer remembered it accurately, but its existence mattered. It shaped expectations, inspired curiosity, and quietly suggested that discovery did not require immediate conquest. It showed that exploration could be measured, deliberate, and thoughtful, a model almost invisible in history, but profoundly instructive for those who could perceive it. By the end of this part, it becomes clear that the journey of Vinland was more than a mere geographical crossing. It was a narrative of human patience, observation, and prudence. It existed quietly in memory, shaping the minds of explorers who came centuries later, long before the Americas became a known destination. The land had been walked, observed, and respected, and the lessons of the Vikings endured silently in stories, shaping future voyages without recognition. In the next part, we will see how knowledge of lands across the Atlantic slowly grew in Europe, how curiosity became ambition, and how the quiet echoes of Vinland intersected with the first steps of organized exploration that would eventually lead to the Age of Discovery. The memory of Vinland, nearly forgotten, would awaken once more in new forms. The ocean had carried the Vikings west. Their memory had survived centuries, and the horizon had begun to whisper possibilities, quietly, patiently, and persistently.
As the centuries unfolded, Europe's relationship with the sea began to change. The oceans, once feared as infinite voids, gradually became spaces of opportunity, curiosity, and imagination. Coastal kingdoms expanded their understanding of tides and winds. Sailors experimented with rudimentary instruments, charts became more detailed, and the compass, though known for some time, was increasingly relied upon for navigation. And yet, amid this growing sophistication, there lingered faint echoes of an earlier age, a memory of lands already touched, quietly preserved in sagas and stories passed down through generations. That land was Vinland.
While Vinland itself had long been abandoned by the Vikings, its story persisted, albeit transformed. European scholars, historians, and travelers occasionally glimpsed fragments of these narratives in the sagas that were finally being written down. The tales spoke of forests, rivers, and unfamiliar people, Skraelings, interactions marked by caution and respect rather than conquest. To most Europeans, these accounts seemed distant, perhaps even fanciful. Grapes growing beyond the north? Dense forests where the soil appeared fertile yet untouched? It defied conventional understanding. Yet in some minds, a seed of possibility was planted, a faint, almost imperceptible awareness that the West might harbor something extraordinary. The political and economic climates of Europe encouraged a shift from cautious observation to calculated ambition. Kingdoms sought trade routes, new markets, and resources that would enhance wealth and influence. Naval technologies advanced. Ships grew sturdier, capable of carrying not just small crews, but larger expeditions with livestock, provisions, and arms. Knowledge of prevailing winds, currents, and seasonal patterns became invaluable. Suddenly, the idea of a distant, rich land to the west was no longer purely speculative, it became a potential objective. And in that potential, Vinland's quiet legacy resurfaced, waiting for those who could connect the dots. Explorers like the Portuguese, the Spanish, and later the English began to test these ideas, venturing into the unknown Atlantic. Their voyages were deliberate, calculated, and informed by the cumulative knowledge of centuries, sometimes unknowingly guided by the paths first traced by Viking ships. Although Vinland itself had faded from active memory, the lessons of patient observation, cautious interaction with unknown peoples, and the practical limits of survival remained embedded in European maritime culture. These were lessons learned not from maps or formal instruction, but from stories transmitted orally, quietly, across generations. The Viking model emphasized understanding over conquest, a principle often overlooked in later narratives of discovery. Yet Europe was not content with mere stories. As curiosity intensified, ambition grew. Explorers were commissioned by monarchs, financed by merchants, and driven by a combination of commerce, religion, and national pride. Every Atlantic voyage carried risk, but also potential reward. Navigators were increasingly trained to read the sky, interpret winds, and track currents. Knowledge, once intimate and oral, was codified, written down, and shared across continents. The Atlantic slowly shrank in human perception, turning from a vast unknown into a navigable corridor leading towards opportunities previously imagined only in stories. And in this gradual shrinking, the echo of Vinland remained, subtle but persistent, like a distant lighthouse guiding the imagination. The story of Vinland thus was both an anchor and a compass. It reminded Europeans that crossing the ocean was possible, that lands existed to the west, and that survival required prudence as much as courage. The Vikings' restrained approach, observing, interacting carefully, and returning home safely, offered an unspoken template. Unlike later European explorers, the Vikings had not sought gold, domination, or conquest. They valued memory, observation, and understanding. These principles would quietly inform future generations of sailors who, knowingly or not, inherited a model of cautious exploration. Vinland, though physically abandoned, survived as a conceptual map, a place both real and instructive, waiting in the background of European consciousness. By the end of this part, it is clear that history does not move in neat, continuous lines. Vinland illustrates how discovery can be temporary yet enduring, immediate yet delayed, observed yet largely unrecognized. The Vikings' journey west did not change Europe at the time. It left no empires, no cities, no conquest. Instead, it left something subtler, quieter, and ultimately more profound. Knowledge preserved in memory, shaping curiosity across centuries, guiding decisions long after the original travelers had vanished from the land itself. In the next part, we will explore the gradual European expeditions to the Atlantic coasts, how the memory of Vinland resurfaced in their planning, and how the blend of caution and ambition, observation and curiosity began to prepare Europe for its next great moment of exploration.
Vinland had been walked, remembered, and quietly waited for the right eyes to see it again. The land of Vinland was forgotten by most. Its memory lingered in whispers, and that quiet whisper was about to awaken the curiosity of an entire continent.
The seeds of European exploration and Vinland's quiet influence. As Europe entered the late 15th century, the continent was poised on the cusp of profound change. Kingdoms had stabilized, trade networks had expanded, and navigational knowledge was slowly becoming more systematic. Sailors and explorers were beginning to see the Atlantic not as a vast, terrifying void, but as a challenge that could be understood, measured, and, most importantly, traversed. In this transformation, the memory of Vinland, quiet and fragile, exerted an unspoken influence. Vinland, the land the Vikings had once touched and then abandoned, remained in the sagas. These stories were repeated for centuries, narratives of cautious exploration, careful observation, and prudent retreat. They were oral memories that had survived by repetition, by their practical utility, and by their ability to teach lessons about survival and understanding. Although physical traces of the Viking presence had vanished from North America, the conceptual imprint lingered, embedded within Europe's slowly growing consciousness of lands beyond the known world. By this period, sailors were trained differently. They observed stars and horizons more systematically. They relied on instruments such as the astrolabe and the magnetic compass, combined with the accumulated experience of previous generations. Knowledge of currents, winds, and seasonal patterns was more widely shared. Yet the Atlantic remained unpredictable, and exploration still required a combination of courage and patience. In many ways, the Vikings had already pioneered this approach centuries earlier. Vinland was a silent tutor, its lessons unspoken, its wisdom preserved in story rather than map. While European powers prepared for maritime expansion, the memory of Vinland offered both caution and inspiration. The sagas illustrated the limits of ambition. The Vikings did not conquer, they did not overextend, they did not jeopardize survival for greed. Their experiences showed that knowledge could exist without permanent possession, and that careful observation often outweighed boldness. To Europeans who later read these sagas, even imperfectly, there was an implicit lesson: the Atlantic could be crossed, and the lands beyond were real, tangible, and reachable, but respect, preparation, and prudence were essential. Moreover, Vinland's story highlighted the fragile interplay between discovery and memory. Human memory is selective. Oral histories preserved some details, lost others, and sometimes transformed events into legend. As these stories reached Europe, they were filtered through new cultural lenses: literacy, Christianity, and political ambition. What had been straightforward observation became narrative, then myth, then inspiration for the next generation of explorers. Vinland had moved from physical space to mental space, influencing imaginations and ambitions across centuries. In addition, the social and economic changes in Europe accelerated exploration. Competition among kingdoms created incentives for new trade routes and territorial expansion. Access to distant resources was becoming increasingly important, and maritime innovation was no longer optional, it was necessary. The quiet knowledge embedded in the Vinland sagas provided subtle reinforcement. The western seas could be crossed, the unknown could be reached, and lands of opportunity existed, albeit at a distance. Yet Vinland's influence remained understated. Most Europeans were unaware of the specifics. Few realized that the Vikings had already walked the North American shores. The land's location was vague, its stories fragmentary, and its lessons subtle. It existed more as an idea than a destination, a reminder that exploration required patience, preparation, and respect for natural limits. These were principles the Vikings had exemplified, and principles that would quietly guide European navigators centuries later, long before the age of discovery reached its peak. As this part draws to a close, we see how history can persist without recognition. Vinland had vanished physically, yet its memories survived through oral tradition, through sagas, and through the practical wisdom embedded in those narratives. The land itself remained unclaimed, unaltered, and largely invisible to the world,
and yet its influence was real, waiting patiently for Europe to catch up with what the Vikings had already experienced. In the next part, we will explore how European expeditions, armed with the lessons of technology, ambition, and stories like those of Vinland, slowly began to map the Atlantic and envision lands across the horizon. The quiet echoes of the Vikings would resurface in concrete voyages, guiding the first steps of Europe's expansion toward the Americas. Vinland had been touched. Its stories had survived centuries, and the world was beginning to remember what had once been discovered, quietly, patiently, and without immediate acclaim.
Part 14. From Stories to Strategy, Europe prepares to cross the Atlantic. By the late 15th century, Europe was buzzing with curiosity, ambition, and a subtle impatience. The world as they knew it was growing smaller, in part due to trade, navigation, and the slow accumulation of knowledge from centuries of experience. And yet, there were still vast unknowns. The Atlantic Ocean remained an intimidating frontier, seemingly endless, filled with storms, currents, and the possibility of disaster. But somewhere in the background of European consciousness lingered a quiet, almost invisible lesson: Vinland. Vinland had not been written in textbooks, nor had it been mapped with precision. Its story existed primarily in sagas, repeated over centuries, filtered through memory, oral tradition, and the cautious interpretations of those who recorded them. These narratives described fertile lands, abundant resources, and encounters with indigenous people whom the Vikings referred to as scragglings. They spoke of ships that had crossed great distances, of careful observation, and of survival in challenging environments. Though the details had softened over time, the core message endured. There was land across the Atlantic, and it could be reached if one respected the ocean and prepared meticulously. European leaders and navigators were beginning to internalize these subtle truths. Monarchs understood that the potential rewards of westward exploration, spices, gold, trade routes, and influence could reshape economies and empires. Mariners, building on Viking lessons of patience and observation, combined traditional knowledge with emerging technology. Magnetic compasses, astrolabes, and improved ship designs allowed longer voyages, better navigation, and increased confidence. Maps were more detailed, charts more precise, yet still imperfect. The unknown remained vast, but the Atlantic's fearsome reputation was slowly giving way to possibility. Within this framework, Vinland's quiet influence persisted. The Vikings had shown that crossing the Atlantic was possible, but it required restraint and prudence. Their journeys were not about conquest or wealth, but observation and survival. They had demonstrated that careful planning, awareness of natural limits, and cautious interaction with unfamiliar peoples were essential to success. These principles, though not explicitly recognized, were absorbed by later explorers, who, centuries later, would attempt the same crossings. Vinland had become more than land. It had become an idea, a conceptual map of possibility and prudence. The transformation from story to strategic knowledge was subtle but powerful. Sagas and oral traditions informed imagination, which in turn guided planning. European navigators absorbed lessons from reports of distant lands, combining these with mathematical calculations, astronomical observations, and practical experience. The Atlantic was no longer only a peril to be feared, it became a corridor of opportunity, a space in which strategy, courage, and meticulous observation could yield tangible results. And all of this rested, invisibly, on the quiet memory of the Vikings' earlier ventures. As exploration began to take shape, the human element became increasingly important. Sailors needed endurance and discipline. Leaders required patience and foresight. Success depended not only on technology or ambition, but on understanding the rhythms of the ocean, the seasonal cycles, and the subtle signs that could mean the difference between life and death.
The Vikings had walked this path first, their survival demonstrating that success was possible without immediate conquest. This subtlety shaped the European approach, blending caution with curiosity, imagination with strategy, in ways that would define the voyages of discovery to come. Vinland's story, though largely forgotten in its specifics, also inspired a philosophical shift. Exploration was not simply about finding treasure or expanding empires, it could also be about understanding, measuring, and learning from what lay beyond. The ocean was a teacher, the unknown land a lesson in humility, and the sagas a guide. Europe, in its preparation for transatlantic journeys, was unknowingly following the rhythms first traced by the Vikings, merging technology, ambition, and the wisdom of memory into a new era of exploration. By the end of this part, it becomes evident that the age of discovery did not begin in isolation. It was built upon centuries of observation, quiet experience, and stories preserved across generations. Vinland, though largely forgotten in its specifics, had survived intellectually and morally, shaping the minds of explorers who would eventually traverse the Atlantic, long before the world officially discovered America. The Vikings' restraint, prudence, and careful observation became invisible threads woven into the fabric of European exploration. In the next part, we will follow the first European voyages that consciously reached toward lands across the Atlantic, and how the faint but enduring legacy of Vinland subtly guided the ambitions, plans, and expectations of these explorers. The story of Vinland, quietly waiting in memory, was about to intersect with Europe's boldest navigational ventures. The Atlantic had been crossed once, its lessons were preserved in whispers and sagas, and Europe was slowly learning to listen.
Part 15. Europe Sets Sail. The First Steps Toward the Unknown. As Europe approached the closing decades of the 15th century, a subtle transformation was underway. The continent, long accustomed to coastal navigation and regional trade, began to perceive the Atlantic Ocean not solely as a threat, but as a corridor of opportunity. Mariners trained in the arts of observation, calculation, and endurance, building upon centuries of practical knowledge that had quietly accumulated from prior voyages, some officially recorded, others preserved in the sagas of the Vikings. Among these, Vinland stood as a silent, unacknowledged mentor, its lessons embedded in European awareness without ever being formally credited. The first steps toward organized exploration were tentative but deliberate. Monarchs commissioned voyages, balancing curiosity with caution, ambition with prudence. The stakes were immense. These were not mere exercises in adventure, they were missions that could determine wealth, influence, and even survival of dynasties. Ships were strengthened, sails improved, and navigational instruments refined. Sailors trained not only in seamanship, but in the subtleties of reading clouds, interpreting wind patterns, and observing birds that might indicate nearby land. Every detail, every decision drew upon the cumulative experience of generations of seafarers and, unconsciously, the quiet memory of the Vikings' westward passages. Vinland's influence, though invisible, was profound. Its story demonstrated that exploration required patience and respect for the natural world. The Vikings had not sought glory or conquest, they had survived and observed. Their sagas emphasized caution, the importance of timing, and careful interaction with unfamiliar lands and peoples. European explorers, though operating with greater ambition and political backing, unknowingly inherited these principles. The Atlantic's dangers, the shifting currents, sudden storms, and unpredictable ice were understood not just as obstacles, but as teachers, much as they had been for the Vikings centuries earlier. The preparation for these first voyages was painstaking. Supplies were calculated with precision. Livestock, provisions, and tools were carefully loaded, accounting for months at sea. Routes were hypothesized based on prevailing winds, seasonal currents, and prior knowledge of islands. Even the smallest observations, whether the flight of birds or the color of the water, could provide invaluable guidance.
The mindset required for this endeavor mirrored the Vikings' approach, a combination of courage, discipline, and meticulous attention to detail. As expeditions finally departed from European ports, the tension between imagination and reality was palpable. Sailors had been trained to expect the unexpected. Legends of distant lands mixed with concrete knowledge of currents, maps, and instruments. Every wave, every cloud, and every gust of wind became a test of skill and judgment. In this environment, Vinland's enduring lesson, observe, respect, survive, remained relevant, even if unspoken. Moreover, these early journeys marked a philosophical shift in European consciousness. The unknown was no longer purely a threat. It could be approached systematically, studied, and integrated into practical knowledge. This was a departure from centuries of tentative localized navigation. The Atlantic was transforming from an abstract challenge into a tangible space, ready to be explored and understood. And behind this transformation, almost invisibly, was the conceptual memory of Vinland, a reminder that humans had crossed the ocean before, had touched new lands, and had returned safely to share their observations. By the end of this part, it is clear that Europe's first deliberate westward voyages were shaped by an intricate interplay of curiosity, preparation, and inherited wisdom. They were informed by centuries of maritime experience, reinforced by observational knowledge, and guided by the principles that had quietly been demonstrated by the Vikings: patience, caution, and respect for both the ocean and the unknown lands it hid. Vinland's quiet presence persisted in thought, in expectation, and in the disciplined preparation of those who dared to cross the Atlantic centuries after it was first touched. In the next part, we will examine the earliest European encounters with the Atlantic islands and coasts, the gradual accumulation of knowledge that would lead to the Age of Discovery, and the ways in which the faint but enduring legacy of Vinland subtly influenced these initial steps into a world that had already been glimpsed once, quietly, centuries before. The Atlantic remained vast and mysterious, yet Europe had begun to learn its rhythms, and the memory of Vinland had already laid the foundation for the voyages yet to come.
Islands, currents, and the first European footsteps. As Europe embarked on its initial Atlantic voyages, the challenges were immense, yet the lessons from the past, though largely unspoken, provided subtle guidance. Sailors were venturing farther from familiar shores than anyone had dared in centuries. They relied on careful preparation, meticulous observation, and a growing understanding of natural patterns: the currents, the winds, the flight of birds, and the clouds on the horizon. Every journey was a test of skill, endurance, and judgment. The faint memory of Vinland, preserved in sagas and oral histories, lingered like a quiet compass in the collective European imagination. The first landfalls were often islands scattered across the North Atlantic: Greenland, Iceland, the Faroe Islands, and smaller, barely recorded rocks emerging from the waves. Each discovery was documented, repeated, and gradually built into the growing European body of navigational knowledge. Explorers learned that the ocean was neither endless nor unknowable. Patterns existed, and careful attention to them could mean the difference between survival and disaster. These lessons echoed the Viking experience centuries earlier. Cross the sea with preparation, observe everything carefully, respect the unknown, and return home with knowledge preserved. European settlements and trading posts were still limited, but the voyages cultivated an awareness of the Atlantic's scale and potential. Vinland had been a fleeting memory, a story told beside fires in northern homes. Now, Europe was beginning to integrate such knowledge into systematic exploration. The lessons of prudence, observation, and survival became more than narratives; they became strategies. The Vikings' restraint, their avoidance of unnecessary risk, their careful mapping of lands and encounters with local peoples provided a subtle template. Europe may not have recognized it, but the principles were there, quietly informing navigation, preparation, and ambition. As these early European explorers moved further, the Atlantic islands became both checkpoints and laboratories.
Each new landfall allowed them to test navigational techniques, calculate distances, measure winds and currents, and anticipate seasonal changes. They recorded details meticulously: types of soil, presence of fresh water, flora and fauna, and any signs of human habitation. These observations were reminiscent of Viking sagas, which had cataloged resources, encounters, and survival strategies centuries earlier. The process of observing, documenting, and learning from the environment was being repeated, amplified, and formalized on a broader scale. Yet the Atlantic remained unpredictable. Storms could appear without warning, icebergs drifted into shipping lanes, and currents occasionally carried ships far from intended courses. Sailors faced immense physical challenges: seasickness, exhaustion, and scarcity of food and fresh water. The psychological strain of venturing into an unknown expanse where mistakes could be fatal was immense. In this context, the careful, restrained approach of the Vikings served as a silent, guiding precedent. Respect the ocean, value observation over bravado, and prioritize survival. Vinland, though long abandoned and largely forgotten in physical terms, remained an intellectual and moral touchstone. It symbolized the balance between ambition and caution, the interplay of discovery and restraint, and the importance of memory in shaping future action. European explorers were beginning to understand that the Atlantic could be crossed successfully, not by rash courage, but through disciplined planning, patient observation, and respect for natural limits, the very principles demonstrated centuries earlier by the Vikings. By the end of this part, the first European footsteps across the Atlantic islands marked a turning point. Knowledge was accumulating systematically. Voyages were informed by prior experience, recorded observations, and incremental learning. The ocean was slowly yielding its secrets, while Vinland's faint echo continued to guide without fanfare. The Atlantic was becoming a bridge rather than a barrier, a corridor of exploration, study, and eventual expansion. Europe was learning to navigate not only the physical waters, but also the intangible legacy of those who had crossed before. In the next part, we will explore the transition from isolated island discoveries to more ambitious voyages that would eventually approach the North American mainland, tracing the indirect but enduring influence of the Vikings' earlier journeys on European planning, ambition, and imagination. The Atlantic's lessons, learned through observation, patience, and experience, were about to converge with Europe's expanding curiosity in ways that would forever alter history. The ocean remained vast and demanding, yet Europe's resolve had strengthened. And the quiet memory of Vinland, like a distant lighthouse, continued to guide those who dared to follow. Charting the unknown, Europe's first Atlantic expeditions. As the 15th century drew toward its close, European nations were poised at the edge of discovery. The Atlantic Ocean, long considered an overwhelming expanse of uncertainty, was gradually being understood through careful observation, trial, and incremental learning. Sailors and explorers had begun to realize that success required more than courage. It demanded preparation, knowledge, and a patient respect for the forces of nature. In this transformation, the subtle legacy of the Vikings' Vinland voyages remained present, guiding Europe in quiet, almost invisible ways. These early Atlantic expeditions were meticulously planned. Monarchs commissioned voyages not on whim, but with precise objectives, testing navigational techniques, observing the ocean's rhythms, and mapping previously unknown islands. Crews were trained to interpret the sky, the stars, the wind, and the waves. They learned to recognize signs of land from the flight of birds, the color of the water, and even the temperature of the sea. Every detail mattered. A miscalculation could mean weeks of drift, loss of provisions, or worse. In this environment, the lessons encoded in Vinland, caution, observation, and survival, resonated more than ever, even if their origin was unrecognized. The Atlantic islands became laboratories of learning. Greenland, Iceland, the Faroe Islands, and smaller archipelagos served as stepping stones. Sailors honed their skills in sailing longer distances, surviving harsher conditions, and recording information systematically. This methodical approach mirrored, in essence, what the Vikings had done centuries earlier: careful observation, patient exploration, and detailed recollection. While Europe applied instruments, charts, and growing mathematical understanding, the underlying principle remained the same: know the sea, respect its unpredictability, and approach new lands cautiously. These expeditions also tested human endurance. Long periods at sea, exposure to storms, and the scarcity of fresh food and water created a harsh, demanding environment. Sailors faced exhaustion, isolation, and fear. The psychological weight of navigating an unknown ocean challenged even the most experienced mariners. It was precisely this need for resilience and discipline that Vinland's story silently emphasized. Survival required more than skill. It required patience, observation, and respect for forces beyond human control. While Europe's ambitions were growing, Vinland's moral and practical lessons endured. The Vikings' restraint, avoiding overreach, interacting cautiously with local populations, and returning safely, served as a template for careful, thoughtful exploration. Europe, in its drive for wealth and discovery, often overlooked these subtleties, yet they persisted unconsciously, shaping approaches to navigation, risk assessment, and strategic planning. By this point, Europe was learning to see the Atlantic as both a challenge and a classroom. Every island discovered, every current mapped, and every navigational error corrected contributed to a growing body of knowledge. Sailors learned not merely to survive, but to interpret the ocean as a living, dynamic system. And in these lessons, the faint and visible influence of Vinland's earlier explorers remained embedded, an enduring guide for those willing to observe, record, and return. As this part draws to a close, the stage is set for a significant shift. These early Atlantic expeditions transformed knowledge from anecdotal story into structured practice. Europe was no longer simply imagining the West, it was actively measuring, recording, and preparing to cross greater distances. Vinland had been a quiet mentor, teaching through example that exploration required patience, foresight, and respect for its lessons. These principles would become indispensable for the voyages that eventually reached the North American mainland. In the next part, we will follow the first European attempts to push beyond the Atlantic islands, to test new routes, and to approach continental lands. We will see how the faint legacy of the Vikings' explorations, preserved in memory and narrative, continued to guide Europe's ambition, observation, and preparation long before the New World became widely known. The Atlantic remained vast, wild, and unpredictable. Yet Europe had begun to understand it, and Vinland's quiet lessons had already begun to shape the journeys yet to come. Venturing beyond the Atlantic islands, Europe's bold steps west. The Atlantic, once feared as an endless expanse of uncertainty, was gradually becoming a navigable frontier. Europe, motivated by curiosity, commerce, and ambition, began to approach these waters with new confidence, tempered by the lessons of centuries past. Vinland, the land first touched by the Vikings and now largely forgotten in physical memory, continued to whisper its lessons through stories and sagas, lessons that Europe would absorb, often without recognizing their source. As navigators set sail from familiar ports toward islands further west, they faced challenges that tested both skill and spirit. Storms could rise without warning, waves could swamp decks, and currents could carry ships far from intended courses. These were not abstract dangers, they were very real, very immediate, and often deadly. Sailors relied on careful preparation, using charts, compasses, and rudimentary instruments to anticipate changes. Every bird sighted on the horizon, every shift in wind or wave, and every color change in the water provided vital information. Observation became a form of survival, a skill honed over decades, yet practiced with new intensity as voyages stretched further from home. Vinland's indirect influence was evident in these expeditions. The Vikings had demonstrated that the ocean could be crossed, lands could be reached, and survival was possible without immediate conquest. Europe, in its own exploratory ambitions, mirrored these lessons, balancing boldness with caution, curiosity with discipline. Exploration was no longer a gamble, it became a practice of strategy, study, and patience. And yet, the Atlantic retained its mystery, reminding travelers that even the most prepared journey required humility. The first glimpses of North Atlantic islands, Greenland, Iceland, and smaller archipelagos, offered both promise and instruction. These islands were stepping stones and laboratories for understanding navigation, currents, and weather patterns. Sailors observed the landscape, documented the environment, and learned to manage supplies over long durations at sea. Every new observation, every incremental success contributed to a slowly expanding body of practical knowledge. This methodical approach echoed the Viking experience centuries earlier. Careful observation, incremental learning, and prudent interaction with the unknown. The human element of these journeys cannot be overstated. Long periods at sea demanded endurance, discipline, and mental resilience. Sailors faced monotony, isolation, and the ever-present risk of disaster. Decision-making required patience and foresight. Leaders needed to maintain morale, anticipate problems, and adapt quickly. These challenges were universal, transcending centuries, and they echoed the experience of the Viking explorers who had first ventured west. The Atlantic was as much a teacher of psychology as it was of navigation, and Vinland's legacy lingered in the background as an unseen guide for managing uncertainty. Europe's expanding knowledge of the Atlantic began to transform imagination into action. Cartographers worked alongside sailors to map islands, currents, and coastlines with increasing accuracy. Reports were meticulously recorded, shared, and used to plan subsequent voyages. The ocean was slowly revealing its secrets, yet its vastness remained a reminder of the limits of human knowledge. Vinland, once a fleeting memory in oral tradition, now became a conceptual model. The idea that lands could be reached, observed, and returned from safely without necessarily seeking conquest. This principle quietly shaped European approaches to exploration, emphasizing observation, caution, and patience over rash ambition. By the end of this part, Europe was standing at the threshold of a new era. The Atlantic islands had been tested, mapped, and studied. Mariners had learned to survive, navigate, and anticipate challenges. Europe was learning not just to cross waters, but to understand them. Vinland's faint echo persisted in the methodology, strategy, and mindset of explorers. Its lessons had transformed from story to practice, preparing a continent to take its first conscious steps toward the vast unknown of North America. In the next part, we will explore how Europe's growing mastery of the Atlantic led to increasingly ambitious voyages, moving beyond islands toward continental shores, and how the quiet influence of Vinland continued to shape these daring expeditions in ways often overlooked by history. The Atlantic still held its mysteries, yet Europe's confidence was growing, and the silent lessons of Vinland were guiding hands, eyes, and minds across the waves.
Crossing into the continent, the first European eyes on North America. By the early decades of the 16th century, Europe's understanding of the Atlantic had matured in ways unimaginable just a few generations prior. The ocean, once an endless expanse of fear and speculation, had become a corridor of observation, experimentation, and cautious exploration. Mariners had charted islands, mapped currents, and learned to anticipate storms, creating a framework for more ambitious voyages. And now, for the first time in living European memory, the possibility of reaching a continental landmass, what would later be known as North America, was within reach. Vinland, centuries earlier, had already been there. Its memory, subtle but persistent, continued to shape Europe's cautious ambitions. Early explorers, sailing beyond familiar islands like Greenland and the Azores, found the Atlantic both predictable and wild. Patterns of wind and current were slowly being understood,
Yet the ocean retained its unpredictability. Encounters with drifting icebergs, sudden squalls, and uncharted shoals reminded sailors of the ocean's constant authority. Every observation mattered. Birds, seaweed, temperature of the water, and the color of the waves were clues to proximity of land. Navigators were now trained to interpret these signs with precision, their survival and success dependent upon the accumulation of centuries of maritime wisdom. And lurking in the background of this growing knowledge was the quiet legacy of Vinland, a model of observation, prudence, and careful engagement with new lands. When the first European eyes glimpsed continental shores, the experience was both awe-inspiring and daunting. Vast forests, rivers cutting through untouched landscapes, and abundant wildlife presented a world simultaneously strange and familiar. Sailors had been prepared for uncertainty, but the sheer scale and richness of the land exceeded expectations. Every feature, the curvature of rivers, the density of the forests, the shifting coastline, was carefully noted, recorded, and later shared with those who remained in Europe. Exploration had become both practical and intellectual, each voyage a lesson in geography, resource management, and human endurance. In this, the Vikings' earlier footsteps on Vinland provided a silent template: observe carefully, respect the land, take what you need to understand it, and return with knowledge intact. These early continental encounters also demanded careful diplomacy. Indigenous peoples, unknown and potentially dangerous, required the explorers' restraint and respect. Misjudgment could lead to conflict or disaster. Sailors had to balance curiosity with caution, ambition with prudence, much as the Vikings had centuries earlier. The lessons of Vinland, survival through observation, patience, and strategic engagement, remained deeply relevant, even if the Europeans had largely forgotten the original sources of these principles. Meanwhile, the logistical and psychological challenges of transatlantic voyages intensified. Long periods at sea tested endurance, and the unknown shores amplified fear and wonder alike. Crews needed cohesion, leaders required foresight, and every decision, from rationing provisions to choosing routes, could determine life or death. Here again, Vinland's legacy subtly shaped the approach. Meticulous planning, careful observation, and gradual accumulation of knowledge were valued over reckless ambition. By the end of this part, it is clear that Europe's first tangible contact with North America was a direct result of centuries of preparation, observation, and inherited maritime wisdom. The Atlantic had shifted from barrier to bridge, from unknown to navigable, and European navigators were learning to read its rhythms. Vinland, though largely forgotten in physical reality, it provided a conceptual roadmap, a reminder that lands could be reached, examined, and respected, and that exploration required patience, discipline, and keen observation. In the next part, we will examine how European expeditions gradually expanded their knowledge of the North American coasts, how encounters with indigenous peoples shaped early expectations, and how the faint but persistent influence of the Vikings' earlier journeys continued to guide navigators in the delicate balance between curiosity, caution, and ambition. Europe was no longer only dreaming of the West, it was beginning to inhabit its possibilities. The shores of North America were now in sight. Europe's knowledge of the Atlantic was taking shape, and Vinland's silent lessons whispered across generations, guiding hands, eyes, and minds toward the continent.
Mapping the coasts, European eyes on the New World. The moment Europe's explorers first glimpsed the continental shores of North America, a profound transformation began. The Atlantic, once a vast and forbidding expanse, was slowly being understood not as a barrier, but as a space that could be measured, recorded, and navigated. Every coastline observed, every river mouth traced, and every forest documented added to a growing reservoir of practical knowledge. Sailors were no longer drifting into the unknown blindly. They were learning to see patterns, anticipate hazards, and record information with meticulous care. This methodical approach, though amplified by instruments and charts,
echoed the principles first demonstrated centuries earlier by the Vikings in Vinland: observation, patience, and cautious engagement with the unknown. Early coastal exploration was painstaking. Navigators meticulously recorded features: the curves of the shoreline, the depth of harbors, the nature of the beaches, the type of trees and vegetation, and even the migration of birds and fish. They took note of fresh water sources, fertile soil, and potential anchorages. Each observation, no matter how minor it might have seemed at the time, became part of a broader system of knowledge that would inform future expeditions. The Atlantic, once feared for its unpredictability, became a teacher, rewarding those who paid attention, disciplined their crews, and approached each landfall with respect. Encounters with indigenous peoples added another dimension to exploration. Europeans quickly realized that survival and successful observation required careful diplomacy, cultural sensitivity, and cautious curiosity. Missteps could be fatal, but careful interaction yielded insights into local resources, geography, and customs. Again, Vinland's earlier lessons resonated. The Vikings had survived not through dominance, but through prudence, observation, and adaptation. The sagas emphasized restraint, patience, and an understanding that survival often depended on learning from those already inhabiting the land. European explorers, consciously or not, were internalizing these principles as they mapped the North American coasts. The logistical demands of coastal mapping were immense. Ships were smaller, more agile, and suited to both open ocean sailing and near-shore navigation. Crews needed endurance, adaptability, and the ability to perform precise observations under stress. Storms, hidden shoals, and sudden weather shifts were ever-present threats. Leaders had to balance the goals of mapping with the immediate needs of survival. Every day at sea required careful rationing, constant vigilance, and strategic decision-making. Here again, Vinland's silent influence lingered. The Vikings' balance of exploration and caution provided an unspoken guide for these early coastal pioneers. Over time, Europe began to build more detailed charts of the Atlantic coastlines. Islands, peninsulas, rivers, and bays were carefully documented, often with sketches and notations about currents, tides, and seasonal changes. This accumulation of knowledge was slow, iterative, and painstaking, but it transformed the unknown into something increasingly concrete. Europe was learning to predict rather than guess, to understand rather than imagine. Vinland's legacy, subtle but enduring, had shifted from oral saga to conceptual framework, a demonstration that careful observation, systematic recording, and patience could render even the vast unknown comprehensible. By the end of this part, the significance of these coastal expeditions is clear. Europe had moved from tentative island hopping to systematic engagement with continental land. Knowledge was growing, patterns were emerging, and the Atlantic was gradually yielding its secrets. Every mapped shore, every recorded river, every careful observation contributed to a growing body of practical understanding. And behind all this, the invisible presence of Vinland persisted, reminding European navigators of the value of observation, patience, and cautious engagement with the unknown. The continent lay in waiting. Europe's eyes had opened, and Vinland's lessons, long silent, were beginning to resonate across the Atlantic once more.
From shorelines to settlement, early European experiments in North America. With the North American coastline slowly revealed through careful observation and meticulous mapping, European explorers began to transition from fleeting visits to more purposeful engagement. The Atlantic, once an imposing barrier of uncertainty, had become a canvas for careful measurement, patient study, and cautious exploration. Ships carried more than maps and instruments. They carried experience distilled from centuries of maritime knowledge and a quiet, persistent echo of the Viking voyages to Vinland, a model of patience, observation, and survival that Europe had inherited without always realizing it. The early explorers were entering an unfamiliar world. Towering forests stretched along the shorelines, rivers carved paths through untouched lands, and wildlife teemed in abundance.
Each day brought new discoveries, edible plants, sources of fresh water, fertile soil, and natural harbors. Sailors meticulously recorded everything, creating logs and sketches that would guide future missions. Every detail mattered, from the color of the water to the angle of a river mouth, from the sound of birds to the nature of the beaches. These records were not merely practical, they were instruments of understanding, turning unknown territory into knowledge that could be shared, interpreted, and applied. Interactions with indigenous peoples were delicate and often unpredictable. Early European visitors had to balance curiosity with caution, respect with ambition. Misjudgment could lead to conflict or disaster. Careful observation and measured action were essential. Here, the subtle lessons of Vinland proved invaluable if unconsciously applied. The Vikings had survived through restraint, observation, and prudent engagement with local inhabitants. European explorers, in navigating these early encounters, were echoing centuries-old principles, emphasizing diplomacy and the careful management of risk. The logistics of these early engagements were equally demanding. Supply lines were tenuous, ships were vulnerable to storms, and long periods at sea tested endurance. Leaders needed foresight, strategic planning, and the ability to maintain morale under difficult circumstances. Sailors required adaptability and discipline, and every small observation had the potential to influence the success or failure of an expedition. In this environment, patience and meticulous record-keeping were as valuable as courage, and the faint, invisible guidance of Vinland's example reinforced these lessons. Over time, these exploratory missions gradually evolved into more sustained ventures. Temporary settlements, trade posts, and small forts began to appear along strategic points of the coast. The knowledge gained from earlier observations, shorelines, tides, currents, and natural resources, was applied to these early attempts at establishing footholds. Europe was no longer simply visiting, it was learning to inhabit, to interact, and to adapt. The Atlantic, once a formidable obstacle, had become a channel for systematic exploration, observation, and preparation for longer-term engagement. By the end of this part, it becomes evident that Europe's growing understanding of the North American coastlines was a combination of methodical observation, incremental experimentation, and careful application of inherited knowledge. Vinland's silent lessons, survival through observation, patience, and cautious engagement, continued to shape European strategy, even if the original stories had been long forgotten. Europe was learning to move deliberately, combining curiosity with careful planning, and turning the Atlantic from an intimidating frontier into a corridor of opportunity. In the next part, we will explore how these early coastal experiments set the stage for more ambitious expeditions, gradually leading to deeper exploration, more structured settlements, and the eventual awareness of the vast potential of North America. Europe was learning not only to cross the ocean, but to understand the land, its inhabitants, and the practicalities of long-term engagement. The continent awaited further exploration. Europe's confidence had grown, but respect remained, and Vinland's enduring lessons continued to guide explorers across the Atlantic. The Atlantic lessons: knowledge, observation, and the seeds of discovery. By this stage, European explorers had begun to perceive the Atlantic not merely as a vast, intimidating expanse, but as a structured, observable system, a network of islands, currents, winds, and coasts that could be studied, understood, and navigated. Centuries of accumulated maritime knowledge, combined with careful observation and systematic record-keeping, were transforming fear into mastery. The faint legacy of Vinland, the land first touched by the Vikings, continued to echo through these developments, quietly informing methods, strategies, and attitudes toward the unknown. Sailors had learned to read the ocean like a living text. Currents were no longer invisible forces, they were predictable pathways that could guide ships westward. Wind patterns, which once seemed capricious and threatening, became tools to be interpreted and utilized. Every bird in flight, Every floating object and even the color and texture of the water provided critical information. Observation had become not just a survival skill, but a scientific practice. Europe was beginning to understand the importance of patience, attention to detail, and systematic recording, a methodology that, in principle, the Vikings had already demonstrated in Vinland centuries earlier. The Atlantic Islands had served as laboratories for this understanding. Greenland, Iceland, the Faroe Islands, and smaller scattered outposts allowed explorers to test navigation, chart courses, and experiment with longer sea voyages. These stepping stones provided a controlled environment in which to refine instruments, improve ship designs, and train crews. Europe's growing competence at sea was therefore incremental, built on careful experience rather than recklessness. Vinland's lessons of observation, restraint, and careful interaction with new lands provided a blueprint for future exploration. European mariners were no longer adventurers driven solely by curiosity. They were increasingly systematic observers, documenting and interpreting each new encounter, each coastline, each wave, and each challenge. In the next part, we will examine how this accumulated knowledge from the Atlantic voyages, combined with early encounters along the North American coasts, laid the groundwork for organized, ambitious expeditions that would ultimately connect Europe more systematically with the New World. The lessons of Vinland, though silent and indirect, would continue to resonate as Europe moved from tentative exploration to more deliberate expansion. The Atlantic had been transformed from an unpredictable frontier into a realm of knowledge and opportunity. Europe was learning to integrate observation, patience, and careful planning into every expedition. Vinland's influence, though subtle and often invisible, had played a critical role. Its legacy of survival, restraint, and careful interaction with new lands provided a blueprint for future exploration. European mariners were no longer adventurers driven solely by curiosity. They were increasingly systematic observers, documenting and interpreting each new encounter, each coastline, each wave, and each challenge. The Atlantic had revealed its secrets gradually. Europe had begun to understand both ocean and land, and the silent guidance of Vinland persisted, shaping the hands, eyes, and minds of explorers ready to push further westward.
When Vinland was forgotten, but never truly lost.
By the time Europe began to speak confidently about the New World, Vinland had already faded into the background of history. Not erased, but softened. It was no longer a destination. It was no longer a place people planned to reach. Instead, it existed as a whisper within old manuscripts, half-remembered sagas and quiet references that few fully understood. This forgetting was not sudden, it was gradual, almost gentle. As European nations expanded their ambitions, they became focused on trade routes, wealth, and imperial competition. Exploration shifted from curiosity to strategy. Maps grew more detailed, but they were also shaped by political priorities. What mattered was not who arrived first, but who claimed, who controlled, and who documented with authority. The Vikings had done none of these things. They had not claimed Vinland as an empire. They had not built lasting cities. They had not written official reports for kings and popes. They arrived, observed, survived, and left. And in doing so, they violated the rules by which later history would be remembered. As printed books replaced oral tradition, the sagas were treated differently. Scholars debated whether they were history or literature. Some dismissed them as exaggerated. Others read them symbolically rather than geographically. Vinland became a metaphor instead of a location, a story rather than evidence. This shift mattered deeply, because history often listens most closely to what is written with authority, not what is spoken carefully. Meanwhile, European explorers who followed, sailing under royal banners, were meticulously recorded. Their journeys were dated, archived, and celebrated. Their names were attached to continents, rivers, and maps. Over time, the narrative solidified.
Europe had discovered America in the late 15th century. Vinland no longer fit. Yet something unusual persisted. Despite being forgotten officially, Vinland never fully disappeared. It continued to surface in footnotes, marginal references, and quiet scholarly debates. Certain descriptions in the sagas were too precise to ignore. The geography felt specific. The resources described, wood, wild grapes, and open meadows, did not align with Greenland or Iceland. This created discomfort, because if Vinland was real, then history was incomplete. As centuries passed, curiosity resurfaced. Scholars began revisiting the sagas, not as myths, but as records shaped by oral accuracy. Linguists analyzed place names, geographers compared descriptions, historians asked new questions, not "is this story true," but "what kind of truth does it hold?" This marked a turning point. Vinland was no longer dismissed outright, it was reconsidered cautiously. At the same time, archaeology matured as a discipline. Evidence was no longer limited to texts. Soil, ruins, tools, and structural patterns began to speak. History was no longer written only by ink, but by earth itself. And slowly, patiently, the ground began to answer. The idea that the Vikings had reached North America no longer sounded impossible. Their ships were capable, their navigation was sophisticated, their survival strategies were proven. Vinland began to feel less like an anomaly and more like an early chapter that had been skipped. By the end of this part, we are left with a powerful realization. History does not forget because something is untrue. Often it forgets because something does not fit the dominant narrative of its time. Vinland did not vanish, it waited. In the next part, we will move toward the moment when Earth and archaeology finally confirmed what the sagas had been saying all along, when forgotten stories found physical proof and silence gave way to evidence. The past was still there, buried, patient, and unchanged, and Vinland was about to speak again.
When the ground spoke, the proof Vinland left behind. For centuries, Vinland lived only in words. It lived in sagas copied by hand. It lived in sentences scholars debated but could not confirm. It lived in imagination, suspicion, and uncertainty. But the earth was silent, and history, when the earth is silent, tends to hesitate. Then, slowly, that silence broke. In the early 20th century, archaeology was no longer driven by legend alone. It had become a discipline of patience, measurement, and restraint. Excavation was careful, interpretation was cautious. The goal was no longer to prove stories right or wrong, but to listen to what the ground itself was willing to reveal. For decades, researchers searched the North Atlantic world. They examined coastlines, they compared soil layers, they studied patterns of settlement left behind by known Norse communities, and still, Vinland remained just beyond reach. Until one place changed everything. On the northern edge of Newfoundland, in a quiet landscape shaped by wind and cold, something unusual appeared. Not a monument, not a dramatic ruin, just subtle irregularities in the earth, mounds that didn't belong to nature alone. At first, they meant nothing, but archaeology teaches patience. As excavation began, the ground told its story slowly. Turf walls emerged, carefully layered, deliberately constructed. Their shape was unmistakable to those who knew Norse architecture. These were not indigenous structures. They were not European colonial buildings. They were older. They were Scandinavian. Ironworking remains appeared next. This was critical. Indigenous cultures of the region did not smelt iron. The presence of worked iron was not symbolic, it was decisive. Nails, fragments, and slag told a story of metal shaped intentionally using techniques consistent with Viking Age practices. No myths were required anymore. The soil had spoken. What emerged was not a city, not a colony, not a thriving settlement meant to last generations.
It was something quieter, more consistent with the sagas. A temporary base, a working site, a place of repair, rest, and cautious exploration. Exactly what the stories described. This discovery reshaped everything. Vinland was no longer a possibility, it was a fact. The sagas, once treated as poetic exaggerations, suddenly gained credibility. Their restraint now seemed intentional. Their lack of glorification felt honest. They had never claimed empire, only presence. History had misjudged them because it expected conquest, not caution. As scholars revisited the texts, new respect emerged. Details once dismissed as embellishment were re-examined with fresh eyes. The distances made sense, the descriptions aligned with geography, even the climate matched seasonal Norse activity. Vinland had been accurate all along. But the most important realization came quietly. The Vikings did not fail in Vinland. They chose not to stay. They understood the limits of distance, resources, and risk. They recognized resistance. They measured cost against survival. And they left, without collapsing, without vanishing, without drama. This decision revealed something profound about Norse culture. Exploration was not obsession. Survival mattered more than symbolism. By the end of this part, history itself feels different, because now we understand that discovery does not always mean domination. Sometimes it means knowing when to leave. Vinland was not forgotten because it was insignificant. It was forgotten because it did not fit the later story of conquest. And yet, its legacy endured, quietly influencing navigation, storytelling, and the boundaries of the known world. In the final part, we will step back and reflect, not just on Vinland, but on what this story teaches us about history itself, memory, and the kinds of truths that wait patiently beneath the surface. The ground has spoken, the past is no longer silent, and the story is almost complete.
What Vinland teaches us about history, memory, and time. By the time we reach the end of this story, something becomes quietly clear. Vinland was never meant to be loud. It was not a conquest. It was not an empire. It was not a turning point marked by banners, crowns, or declarations. It was a moment of contact, a brief, careful meeting between humans and an unfamiliar world. And perhaps that is why it feels so different from the histories we usually remember. The Vikings did not arrive in North America to change the world. They arrived to understand it. They observed the land, they tested its limits, they weighed opportunity against danger, and when the balance shifted, they left. There was no collapse, there was no mystery, there was no failure, just a decision. History, however, often struggles with stories like this. We are trained to remember what expands, what dominates, what transforms visibly. We remember empires because they leave scars. We remember conquest because it redraws borders. We remember noise. Vinland left silence. For centuries, that silence was misunderstood. Scholars searched for permanence where there had never been an intention to stay. They expected monuments instead of footprints, cities instead of camps, control instead of caution. And so Vinland slipped through the cracks of traditional history, not because it wasn't real, but because it didn't behave the way history expected it to. Yet time has a way of restoring balance. When archaeology spoke, it did not shout, it confirmed quietly. Turf walls, iron fragments, spatial patterns, evidence that matched the tone of the sagas perfectly, modest, practical, restrained. The earth did not reveal a myth, it revealed consistency. And in doing so, it reminded us of something essential. Truth does not require grandeur. Vinland teaches us that discovery is not always about possession. Sometimes it is about awareness, about knowing that something exists even if it does not belong to you, about understanding limits, of distance, of culture, of endurance. The Vikings crossed an ocean centuries before it was supposed to be possible. Not by accident, not by luck, but through observation, patience, and respect for nature's rhythms. They trusted stars, currents, winds, and experience. They listened more than they announced. That legacy matters because it reminds us that history is not only written by those who stayed, but also by those who knew when to leave. Today, when we look at maps of the world, Vinland no longer needs a border. Its importance lies elsewhere. It exists as proof that human curiosity has always pushed gently beyond the horizon, that contact does not always mean conquest, that memory can survive quietly, waiting for the right moment to be understood. Vinland waited. It waited in stories told by firelight. It waited in manuscripts half believed. It waited beneath the soil, untouched and patient. And when the world was ready, not to glorify it, but to understand it, it spoke. As this series comes to an end, we are left not with a dramatic conclusion, but with a calm realization. History is not only about what changed the world loudly, it is also about what passed through it softly. Vinland was one of those moments, a brief meeting between continents, a quiet crossing of boundaries, a reminder that the past is often wiser, calmer, and more measured than we expect. And now, as the story fades, Vinland returns to where it has always belonged, not lost, not forgotten, but understood. That's all for today. Let the story rest here. Have a calm and peaceful night.